You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Welcome, friend, to episode number 109 of the Business for Good podcast. As predicted, the last episode with my wife, Toni Okamoto, was a real crowd pleaser. Apparently, people really want to know how social media influencers make a living, and they appreciated Toni's transparency about her various revenue streams and the kind of money that influencers can make. Now, speaking of influencers and my wife, if you've not yet ordered her latest cookbook, but you want to, you can get it anywhere books are sold, or you can just go to plantbasedonabudgetcookbook.com. Since the book was released on March 7th, 2023, in its first week, it shot up to number 23 on all of Amazon. That's not 23 out of all the cookbooks, 23 on all of the 30 million books that are currently sold on Amazon.com. Will Toni make her goal of being a New York Times bestseller? We will soon find out. If so, it would really illustrate the power of social media, as she received nearly no national coverage in the media for her book release and really has just been driving sales of the Plant-Based on a Budget cookbook quick and easy via social media posts from her community. Okay, now speaking of episodes that are popular, we get a lot of good downloads on these newly released episodes. It's gratifying to know that there's a lot of people out there who get enough from the show that there's a really good base of listeners. I will note, however, that it is remarkable to me that while new episodes get substantial downloads, episodes from nearly a year or two ago, or maybe even more, get very few downloads these days. That's a real shame, since nearly all of them are quite evergreen. And if we re-release them today, they'd no doubt get good listenership, just like they did when they were first released. For whatever reason, people don't seem to go back to older episodes to listen to them that often. If you have ideas on this, especially whether we should re-release some back episodes as new ones, perhaps with brief updates on the companies, just let me know. We do have a best of section on the website homepage to show off some of the all-time most downloaded episodes, but I'd be grateful for your opinion about whether we should just make an effort to increase consumption of older episodes in any way. You can email me by going to businessforgoodpodcast.com and let me know your thoughts. Okay, now moving on to this episode. Back in 2021, there was a lengthy analysis published by a now-defunct website called The Counter, and it concluded that cultivating animal cells, or making cultivated meat or clean meat, at a commercial meat industry scale was simply a pipe dream. Josh March was enthusiastic about the clean meat space, but he didn't really disagree with this analysis. But he thought that if you could bioengineer the animal cells to get a lot more comfortable at production scale and add those finished cells then into otherwise plant-based meats, you could both commercialize meat cultivation and make animal-free burgers taste even better. Not only did Josh persuade himself of it, but he persuaded investors too. In 2022, a very difficult time for startups to raise venture capital money, Josh's startup, SciFi Foods, raised $22 million to bioengineer better animal-free beef. Of course, many in the cultivated meat world shy away from talking about or practicing bioengineering, sometimes called genetic modification, for fear that it will turn consumers off. But not Josh Marsh. He is betting big that technologies like bioengineering and CRISPR are actually the only path to commercial success in this field, and so he is going all in. In this interview, we talk about Josh's story, including 2 previous startups resulting in acquisitions, his motivations for doing this work, and what he sees as the future of meat. I'm confident that you're going to find this conversation with Josh March as interesting as I did. Josh, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
It is great to have you. We've known each other for many years, and I have only known you in the context of the cultivated meat area, although I guess when we first met, which I think was 2016, if my memory serves me correctly, at the New Harvest Conference in San Francisco, I guess we would have been calling it cultured meat back then. So I've only known you as a cultured or a cultivated meat guy, but you actually have quite a lengthy entrepreneurial history prior to being interested in meat. So I know that you have founded several companies before this one, some of which were acquired. So congratulations on that. But they weren't in the environmental or animal welfare or climate space. They had to do nothing with food or anything. So why don't you just first tell us what were the companies that you spent most of your career running, and how'd you get interested in meat in the first place?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting story. when I was at university, I ended up I got interested in kind of entrepreneurship, and my very first real startup was an e-commerce company that was actually doing eco and fair trade goods, partly from Africa because my mum was living in Kenya at the time, that I was kind of packaging up nicely and selling in the UK. I was only 20 and I was a law student with no business experience when I tried setting up this company, and really had no idea what I was doing. And the company essentially failed. I kind of figured a lot out and got it up and running and did make some money. It was making some money, but realized that I didn't have enough resources to do the company in the way it needed to be successful, and I had to shut it down. And
for how long did you run it before realizing it was going to shut down?
it was probably like a year and a half or so.
Yeah. Did you consider it devastating?
Operational.
Like, did you consider it devastating to see the company that you'd founded shut down?
Yeah, it was a big ego hit. I was a pretty arrogant, kind of overconfident 20-year-old thinking I was going to take over the world instantly. Mm-hmm. And so, I learned a lot of painful lessons from that failure. Yeah. A big part of it being that I should listen to other people. As I was kind of thinking about all the things that had gone wrong, I realized that there were people who told me that every single mistake I made, someone had pointed out, and I hadn't listened.
The problem is, though, that when you talk to people who actually succeeded, they'll say the same thing, that all these people told me it would never work, and then they finally made it work, right? So they proved all the doubters wrong. And so you have no way of really ascertaining whether you're in the camp that you were in, which is where they were actually right, or whether these other people just lacked the vision that this particular founder had.
Yeah, but when I say listen to other people, I don't necessarily mean do what they say, right? You've got to strike your own course and make your own decisions. But if there are people with experience in the industry pointing out mistakes and challenges, you should pay attention to that. Not necessarily as a reason to not do the business, but as a way to figure out, okay, well, is this a real problem? And do I need to figure out how to solve it?
Well, we're going to get all into that actually later in this interview. Yeah. I want to hear your personal story first, because as you know, there are many people who are quite expert who are saying, hey, cultivated meat is never going to work at scale. And I know obviously you disagree with that. So we're going to get into that as to why you think these experts are wrong. But first, let's just hear. So your first company flopped, then what?
Yeah. And, that experience got me thinking a lot about, why I failed and what I needed to do better. And one of the things that I really felt that I'd failed on was online marketing and how to reach out and connect with customers. And it was just at the time that social media was really kind of taking off and Facebook was exploding. And around that time, Facebook launched their first application platform that allowed third parties to build apps on Facebook that could engage with customers. And I just thought that was a really unique and powerful way of connecting with people in a way that just hadn't existed before. And so I ended up learning how to code, meeting up with developers, starting building apps on the Facebook platform, and ended up founding an agency that became one of the first agencies in the world and to be building Facebook apps for big brands. And we became a close partner of Facebook. It became a successful, profitable agency in the UK. I realized that I didn't want to be doing an agency. I wanted to be doing a company that could have bigger impact. And we had an idea to spin out a software company that would help companies do customer service over social media, and ended up spinning that company out as called Conversocial. We ended up selling the first agency and raised venture capital for the software company Conversocial. And I kind of ended up running it for kind of 8-9 years or so before stepping down and having it acquired. And then launching SciFi. Now,
there's lots of different types of acquisitions, obviously. Like, were these financially lucrative for you as a founder, or were they just benefiting the investors with the preferred shares? Like, did these have a consequential impact on your material well-being?
It was a decent but not an earth-shattering exit.
Got it. So, but did you feel like you were well compensated for those 8 or 9 years?
Mostly in how much I learned. But certainly enough that I can afford a down payment on a house in San Francisco and childcare.
A down payment on a house in San Francisco, I know, is no small feat. So that is pretty impressive.
So I feel very grateful for that time period.
Yeah.
I mean, we can get into the details there, but.
Yeah, nice. I will only note my parochial interest in this topic by asserting that Forbes did just name that the best city in the entire state of California to live in is Sacramento. So, so should you, Josh, decide, I am. So should you decide, you want to go northeast a little bit, your welfare will improve. But anyway, all right. So, after Cover Social gets acquired, you have a little bit more cash in your pocket, and then you decide, I want to do meat. Why? Like you're focused on these types of companies that are helping essentially communicate with customers, which is very different than wanting to rebuild the meat industry. So what happened?
Yeah.
Like why were you even at the New Harvest Conference in 2016 where we met?
Yeah, and that was years before actually Conversocial was acquired, or I stepped down because it had been an obsession of mine for a long time. Well, the side story is that I'd basically been obsessed with the idea of cultivated meat for almost 15 years. I actually, around the same time that kind of we were spinning out Conversocial and all that stuff was happening, I'd read a couple of key books. The first book I'd read was The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. And that book got me incredibly excited by the huge potential that technology could have to like make a huge positive impact on the world and change the world for the better. And made me realize that could happen in our lifetimes. That the exponential of technology meant that we could really have dramatic positive impacts on the world. And around the same time, I read this science fiction book, Player of Games by Ian M. Banks. And in Ian M. Banks' futuristic kind of culture society, he talks about the fact that they cultivate their meat and they grow it in tanks instead of having to kill animals.
That's cool.
And as soon as I read that, it just kind of like, it was like a light bulb going off in my brain. And I was like, as I was thinking about all this amazing change that could happen in the world through technology, and like, how's human civilization going to look like in the next 20, 30, 40 years? I was like, it can't just be that we're like cutting down the rest of the rainforest and throwing like billions of animals into factory farming. Like that can't be the future. Like that's not like the utopian future that I was like dreaming of. And it just seemed clear to me that a major part of that future had to be that we could figure out how to create real meat without the need for all the environmental devastation and animal welfare issues of conventional and animal agriculture.
It's really interesting that both the combination of a nonfiction and a fiction book had this impact on you, because I read Singularity is Near, and I don't recall Kurzweil talking about meat in the book. So I was thinking, like, how did he get to that place? And, I think about this a lot, the fact that it is typically novels that have the biggest impact on people. Like, people think, oh, well, serious-minded people read nonfiction. But, if you think about the books that have had like the biggest impact on readers in the world, it's usually novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle, 1984, Animal Farm, Fahrenheit 451. Like these kind of culture-changing books are often novels. Even if you look at the Bible, it's basically just a collection of stories. Yeah. And it's very rare. It's very rare that you find a nonfiction book, aside from Clean Meat, of course, that has a major impact, right? No, I'm just kidding about Clean Meat. But, you do see like there are some nonfiction books. Animal Liberation by Peter Singer is one that has, been truly transformative. But, even on the right, books like Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead are really like considered canonical by a lot of people and had a transformative effect on them. And so anyway, I find it interesting that it was a novel that helped to spark your interest here rather than reading, some nonfiction book on the topic.
Yeah. And I think that especially science fiction, right? If you're working as an entrepreneur in technology, how do you think about what kind of future do we want to build? And, science fiction authors are there spending all day, every day thinking about how the future could look. Right. And so I think it's an amazing source of inspiration.
Well, if you're interested in futuristic books that do touch on this topic, I'll make a recommendation to you called Tender is the Flesh, which is a short novel by an Argentinian woman named, I think her name is Agustina Basterreca. But I read it and absolutely loved it. But I don't want to give anything away. But it's not so much about cultivated meat as it is about so-called defective humans taking the place of animals, like for all the uses that we use animals for today. But it's quite a compelling story, I found. So cool. if you're into futuristic novels, Okay, cool.
For
So
sure.
all right, so you're reading Player of Games, you're reading Ray Kurzweil, and you're like, okay, maybe we can actually make this a reality. At that point, I mean, I presume this was after 2013, so the Mark Post burger had already been debuted, so you may have been familiar with that, or is that not
No,
true?
it was actually before, quite a bit before 2013.
Okay.
We're probably talking like 2009,
Wow.
2010 that I read those books and started thinking about this.
So New Harvest existed, but there was nobody really doing this in the commercial sense, and even really in the academic sense for the most part.
Yeah, and so I actually felt like I didn't realize that anyone was kind of thinking about it. And in my mind, I was like, all right, I'm going to have to figure out how to invent this technology. And so, my kind of secret plan back then was, all right, I'm working on these like social media software companies. We'll have to make a load of money this way. And then you plow that money into figuring out how to make cultivated meat a reality. Now, so that was kind of my plan for years. Now, company ended up taking a lot longer than I thought. It was a kind of overall between those two companies, it was like a 12-year journey. And within that time, I started to hear about other scientists and entrepreneurs working on cultivated meat. Obviously, the Mark Post burger in 2013, but then especially 2016, which is when New Harvest did that first conference in San Francisco. That was really where I kind of met a lot of the early players. And at that point, I wasn't sure if I would need to go and do a company in the space, honestly. And I was like, great, like maybe this is happening without me. Like my main goal was wanting to see it in the world. And so I started doing a bit of investing and a bit of advising and became a donor to New Harvest and was like, maybe I'll just be a supporter. And I spent a number of years just spending time with the people and learning as much as I could about the science and the biology and the technology. And over that time, I kind of came to this conclusion that there were some pretty major challenges that I felt were going to prevent cultivated meat from really reaching the impact that I knew it needed to have. And I kind of, especially around the cost of cultivated meat, and I felt kind of a bit disenchanted with what I was seeing in the industry. And honestly started to feel like I needed to go launch a company in the space myself in order to make it happen. That's maybe a little bit egotistic and messianic, but that's kind of the truth of how I felt. And it was really that drove me to say, okay, I need to get on this and do a company ASAP.
And so the company was originally called Artemis Foods, right? Before you changed the name. Why the Greek goddess of wildlife? Like, what is it about Artemis that led you to call your company this?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I knew that, hey, this is going to be a consumer company, and we're going to have to do some real work on branding and brand strategy, right? And so when we first started, we were in stealth, and we just kind of needed a placeholder name. And I'm a fan of a lot of the Greek myths and stories. I'm actually listening to a book on them at the moment called Mythos, which is awesome. I'm really enjoying. It's kind of a retelling of the Greek stories.
Oh, and, cool. Is it like a retelling that kind of is like a modern version, looking at some of the villains who actually maybe aren't villainous, or is that a different book that I'm thinking of?
I think that's a different book. It's a great book by Stephen Fry, who's like a UK treasure intellectual. Yeah. And it's basically it's retelling the original stories. It's not updating them, but it's just he uses his own words and references modern stuff.
There is a different book. I'll include it in the show notes at businessforgoodpodcast.com, because I too am a fan of Greek mythology, and I haven't read this book, nor can I remember the name now, but again, I'll include it in the show notes, which is basically like a more woman-centric telling of the Greek myths, and oftentimes many of the female gods are not portrayed in the best light back then. So it's a different retelling. But anyway, all right, Mythos. So we'll include a link to that book also in the notes.
Yeah. And Artemis is obviously the goddess of the hunt and wild animals. And so it felt fitting as a placeholder.
Yeah, cool. All right. So, we don't need to like belabor the name change issue. Obviously, companies change their names all the time. In fact, I'll mention there's an updated paperback edition of Queen Meat that is coming out. And this is really the first opportunity to update the book in the last 5 years. And one of the updates is like all these companies have changed their names. It's like Memphis Meats and Clara
Right.
Foods. All these companies now they're Upside Foods and Every. And so there's a lot of just and in the book it's Hampton Creek, not Eat Just. So that's like one of the key things that is getting changed here. But aside from that, let me ask you as we get into the cultivated meat of the matter here, Josh. So you and I met in 2016. If I had said to you 7 years from now, in the year 2023, what percent chance do you give to cultivated meat being for sale somewhere in the United States? Mm-hmm. Not on Walmart shelves, but just for sale anywhere. What would you have said in 2016?
Well, in 2016, I would have said 100%, Wow,
yeah.
I was kind of, wide-eyed, bushy tail, kind of excited about everything that was going on. Now, if you'd asked me a couple of years after that, that percentage would have gone down significantly.
Yeah. What about in 2020? If I had said that by 2023, will anyone be selling it at all in the United States?
Yeah, I maybe would have given it a 25% chance.
Huh. Wow, pretty low. Okay.
So no, I think obviously right now we're seeing that almost definitely will be, right? Upside will be selling their chicken, I think, in the next few months. I would guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's hope so. I mean, people have been saying it's quote months away for some time now, but nobody hopes that's true more than I do, of course. But, I want to ask you why, and then we can get into what SciFi is doing that's different from everybody else, like why you felt the need to come in and do your own company. But why is it? There was so much optimism. There's been a ton of money poured into the space. Why is it? Not just the lack of regulatory approval, because even if Upside is allowed to sell, it still is going to be a very tiny amount that is being sold, right? Like, it's the industry, even under optimistic projections, is going to be less than 1% of the total volume of animal-based meat for maybe another decade or so. I mean, there's 100 billion pounds of animal-based meat that's produced in the US every year. So, to get to, if you look at, what companies like Believer and Eat Just, they say they're building these huge plants that will be able to produce tens of millions of pounds. So, when you combine them all, maybe you get to 100 million. So you're, not even a tenth of 1% there. So the question is why? Why is it taking so long? And what do you think are the hurdles that you are going to overcome to change that?
Yeah. Fundamentally, it's around cost and scale, right? It's how can you scale up cell culture and do it cheaply enough, right? Because a food product, any food product, including meat, is fundamentally cheap, right? Even premium meats is still extremely cheap. Even bluefin tuna is still extremely cheap when compared to the cost of cell culture as it's been done for decades in biopharma, right? And so you really have to take something and figure out how to drop the price by orders of magnitudes and sometimes increase the scale by orders of magnitudes. And the reality is, if you look at the history of biomanufacturing and fermentation, getting any biomanufactured product or process or cell line to real manufacturing scale is incredibly challenging. You're talking about years of work, years of investment, sometimes a lot of risk as you're scaling up, right? It's not something that is easy. And the kind of default way of doing that in cultivated meat makes it even harder. And there's a few parts of that. First, a lot of companies are trying to do that without any kind of genetic engineering. My essential conclusion, and we'll talk about this more, is that that's just not really viable. Right? If you look at any biomanufactured cell line, whether it's fermentation or not, that can be scaled up and produce at scale, it's generally a pretty engineered cell line in order to do that.
For animal cells, right? Yeah.
And
not necessarily.
And bacteria and fermentation as well.
Yeah.
And yeast.
Well, I'm just thinking, I'm only playing devil's advocate because as listeners will soon hear, or listeners who have been listening for a while know, I think bioengineering is essential. But just as a counterexample, I mean, corn, QUORN, for decades has a massively scaled industrial fungal fermentation operation where they sell products for only dollars a pound with a wild strain of fungi that has never been not only not bioengineered, they haven't domesticated it in any way, not any natural not any directed selection at all.
Correct. Yeah, that's a little different because it's actually growing the kind of yeast as the product, or the mycelium in that
The
case,
fungi.
the fungi
Right.
as the product itself, as opposed to like
Right.
precision fermentation where you're trying to get a cell line to produce something else or cultivating.
Yeah. Very much so. Very much agreed. And just for people who are not initiated, we're talking about the difference between growing essentially, the organism for itself, called biomass fermentation, or using the organism as basically a factory to produce something else. It's kind of like having the chickens for the chicken meat or the chickens for the eggs, right? And so in some cases, you're doing precision fermentation to have the chicken lay a special kind of egg that you want, and whether it be animal protein or not.
Exactly. And, obviously in cultivated meat, the cell is the product as well. But you're asking that animal cell to grow in a situation which is extremely unlike the situation those cells normally grow in, right? And so, and this is one of the big realizations we had, is that when you take a cell from an animal, from a cow muscle, right, that cell has got all kinds of characteristics and behaviors which fundamentally have got nothing to do with how it tastes, but which do make it extremely expensive and complicated to try and produce outside that cow. And that's where we think genetic engineering plays a really important role in figuring out how to solve those problems. So anyway, let's say there's more problems.
So what is it?
But that's one of them.
Let's talk about that, because I think under the common view of people is like, well, if you take these cells out of the animal's body and you put it in a cultivator that is the same temperature and the same pH, the cell basically thinks that it's still inside the animal's body and it does what it would normally do, which is grow into meat. And you're saying it's a whole heck of a lot more complicated than that. One of the reasons I presume you're saying that is because you need cell densities that are just way, way higher than what people typically get in these bioreactors. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'd say there are three key challenges. There's obviously more, but there are three key challenges when you take just a kind of muscle cell. The first challenge is that cell naturally only wants to grow attached to other cells or a surface. Right? And so you can grow it, in 2D in a flat layer of cells on a plate. But if you want to manufacture it, you need to grow it in a bioreactor, right? It needs to be floating in liquid where you can get it to meaningful cell densities, not just attached to the outside of the bioreactor where you'll get almost nothing. So that's the kind of first fundamental challenge of cultivated meat. Can you even get your cells to grow in a bioreactor? If you can't do that, kind of forget about it. The second challenge is that animal cells will only grow when they're being told to grow. And they're being told to grow in the body when they receive certain signals. Those signals come in the form of hormones or growth factors, which, if you want to reproduce outside the animal, you're producing those recombinantly, and they can be extremely expensive to produce. Thousands, maybe even millions of dollars per gram. And ultimately, we realized that the price of those growth factors needs to be reduced by about 1,000-fold in order for cultivated meat to actually become kind of affordable. That's another challenge. And then the third challenge is, even if you've solved those and you've got your cells growing in a bioreactor, the normal metabolism of the cell limits the cell density that they can grow at. And if you don't have a certain high cell density, then you're going to need to spend huge amounts of capex on bioreactors. And that really becomes important as you're looking at the financial model of, hey, how much can you actually spend on a production plant and what kind of revenue you're going to get from that? What's the IRR? Like, it really becomes a very important part of the model. And so if you can't get sufficient cell density, again, the financials just don't make sense. And so you really need to solve all of those problems.
Right. So, what do you think if you're pitching investors and you're talking about your rate of return, you're going to build a factory, and how many years is it going to pay for itself here? Is it single digit years?
Yeah, that's the goal. That's the goal, right? There's certain hurdle rates when it comes to IRR, and those kind of fluctuate depending on the economic environment. But, you've got to have really positive IRR on the capex you're spending to show that it's going to be a worthwhile investment. And, ultimately, one of the things that I think is really important for the industry and anyone in biomanufacturing is you have to map out those numbers. You have to do a full, what's called a techno-economic assessment or analysis, where you understand all of the unit economics, all of the inputs, all of the behaviors of the cell, all of the capex going into the bioreactors, all of the energy usage, the staffing. You understand how all of that feeds into the financial model. And you really need to get down to the smallest details to understand that.
Cool. And yeah, just for those who maybe aren't as financially literate, I just want to say IRR is internal rate of return. So basically, how quickly can you pay this thing off for what you're calling the CapEx or the capital expenditures here. So if you're going to spend $100 million making a cultivated meat plant, in how many years will you have $100 million of profit basically from that plant that pays for it there?
Correct.
So you're using bioengineering in order to overcome these hurdles that you were mentioning, basically to get the cells to be happy in a suspended state, to get them to grow at far denser cell densities than they would normally grow at. But still, you're not talking about making a whole burger out of animal cells, right? So what is it that you want to make? Because I looked at the life cycle analysis that you all did, and you're talking about essentially a hybrid burger that is partially animal cell and partially plant-based. And so I'd love to know, what is it that you intend to make? How meaningful of a contribution are the animal cells, and what are they bringing to the table? How is it better than an Impossible Burger?
Yeah. So my dream, right, and our goal as a company is to eventually get to the point where we can produce 100% cultivated meat, and we can produce any kind of meat product at scale and in an affordable way. There are a number of steps needed to get there. And the first step is going to be blended products that are still mainly plant-based, but which use cultivated cells essentially for flavor, right? To bring in the fats and the proteins that are responsible for the flavor and experience of meat. And we found that we can actually have a pretty transformative effect on the flavor of essentially a plant-based product, even with pretty small inclusion rates at the kind of 10%-ish, 10 to 20% inclusion rate. It really masks any of the kind of plant-based off notes and creates all of these kind of beefy, meaty kind of smells and aromas and tastes, which just otherwise are really lacking. And you get to the point where it just tastes like beef in a way that even the Impossible Burger, which is the best plant-based burger, still doesn't, it's in this kind of uncanny valley where you close your eyes and you bite the actual burger and it still basically tastes like plant protein. Well, and our burgers, they taste like beef.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to try your burger, but I will tell you that I have a test for all these products. I call it the Eddie test. So this is relating to my dog, Eddie.
Okay.
And he is a vehemently anti-plant-based meat dog. He will not let it pass his lips. He does not care. You can, cook it anyway. It doesn't matter. He hates plant-based meat. However, he's very happy to eat Impossible products. And so I theorized it must be the heme in the burger that is actually satiating his meat tooth. However, he's quite happy to eat the Impossible chicken nuggets too, even though they don't have heme in them. So I don't know what Impossible is doing, but I'm telling you, this is a very discerning dog who hates plant-based meat normally, and he's very happy to eat Impossible.
I mean,
so
maybe he likes soy and doesn't like pea, which is something that
maybe that's so. But I've given him many soy-based products that he doesn't want to eat Gardein, he doesn't want to eat Boca, other things that have soy. He's not into it. So I will do an Impossible. This would be a very expensive test to do, but an Impossible and a SciFi product for him one day. And
it's actually not that expensive anymore. So when you come down, visit the lab. Obviously, he can't come in the lab, but he can come into the office, and we can bring some burgers out for him to try.
This reminds me of the old hit job on what was then Hampton Creek when Bloomberg reported they had Josh Tetrick's dog was in the lab. I don't know if you remember this. It's back in 2016 or 17. The big scandal was that his dog went in the lab. But no, Eddie will not go in a lab. I promise you that. But yeah, it'll be fun to do. So you're making a blended burger that's 90% plant-based and 10% with animal cells, and you think that 10% of animal cells these are all muscle, or some of them animal fat also, or is all the fat plant-based?
Yeah, well, so let me talk a bit about why we're doing this and why these will be the first kind of products that really will exist in the market, full stop, not just with us. There are two challenges when you're talking about 100% cultivated meat. One challenge is just financial, right? So we just had this whole conversation talking about the CapEx and the IRR, right? One of the outputs of our own techno-economic modeling was that, if we assume the progress that we know we can make through bioengineering, and we assume kind of standard bioreactor technology today and all, cost of inputs that we know are true today, then you can get the IRR to work on the CapEx for a 10-ish, 10, 20% inclusion rate, right? That works financially. But if you increase
when
that,
you say get the IRR to work, how many years of the payback is that? 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah,
like what does
exactly.
it mean to
kind
work?
Of single digit year paybacks, kind of IRR,
Okay,
get above the kind of 16, 17% kind of hurdle
got
rate,
it.
which is common,
Okay,
right? But you're still talking, if we're talking about a facility that could make 100 million burgers a year, right? You're still talking 150, $200 million of CapEx.
right. So, and just to be clear, 100 million burgers, presumably they're quarter pounders. So that's
Correct.
25 million pounds of product, 10% of which is animal cell. So, 2.5 million pounds of animal cells, basically, for a capex of, what were you saying, $100 million?
150
million. Okay.
Yeah.
So $150 million basically to produce 2.5 million pounds of animal cells.
Correct. Now,
Got it.
if you're making, and you can, how much can you sell a burger for? $2 a quarter pounder burger, maybe, right? Is our projection. Now, if you're talking about 100% cultivated, times that capex by 10 for the same revenue, right? So you're talking about $1.5 billion of capex at today's bioreactor technology. The IRR on that does not look anywhere close as good, right? You're not going to get financing for that kind of facility.
Right. Yeah, you essentially need government grants in massive amounts, or government low interest loans in massive amounts, like the kind that Solyndra got, a couple hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
And that's just one of the problems, right? Because all the stuff we've been talking about today is just how do you grow a load of cells in bioreactors? But when you take those cells out of the bioreactor, what do you have? You have individual cells, right? So those individual cells may be incredibly tasty beef cells with all the fats and the proteins that create that flavor and experience of meat, but they're not tissue. They're not 3D structured muscle tissue and fat tissue. And if you want to make a product that's 100% cultivated, even if it's not structured, right, you need to have that real texture. And the technology to create that kind of structure today, the kind of tissue engineering, ultimately is still very small scale, very expensive, and not really scalable at all. Now, I'm privy to some new technology that is being worked on by various companies and various B2B players. And there are new bioreactors and technologies being developed that over the next 5 to 10 years, I think may make some of that creation of 3D muscle tissue viable. But the technology that people are using today is very small scale and very expensive and nowhere near ready to actually go into manufacturing.
Interesting. Yeah, our February 1st episode for 2023 was with Taryn Wolf, the CEO of Matrix FT, which is one of these B2B players that you're mentioning, which is basically making microcarriers and scaffolding agents and so on to sell to companies like yours, asserting that they can help overcome some of these challenges that you are discussing. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes for this episode as well at businessforgoodpodcast.com. So let me ask you then, who's the audience, right? So for a burger that's partially plant-based, partially animal cell culture, is it the same audience, for an Impossible Burger? Or is it a different set of people who might be interested in that type of a hybridized burger?
I think when you look at the plant-based meat industry, it's interesting. Because if you zoom out and just look at what's happening with just people in America, right? Almost 50% of the population now considers themselves some kind of flexitarian, right? People don't want to stop eating meat. Right? They just don't. They generally love the taste of meat. They love the experience, the cultural, whatever it is, everything around it. And I include myself in that as well. But people are increasingly aware of the problems with meat, right? The problems with deforestation, the problems with factory farming, the problems with climate change. And often, they want to make a better decision. But the way that, buying food ultimately is an emotional decision. And when it comes to those kind of intellectual things about being better for the world, right, they may agree with that. But when it comes to buying a burger, ordering a burger in a restaurant or whatever it is, they don't want to make a sacrifice. And ultimately, taste is a major part of that. And I really view taste as one of the biggest inhibitors, along with price, but taste being one of the biggest inhibitors to people buying alternatives. And I think there's so many people have tried meat alternatives and plant-based meat over the past 5 years. Almost everyone's tried it, but it's only a relatively small percentage of meat eaters who've continued buying it regularly. Right. And ultimately it's that repeat rate, which is really what drives the success or failure of a company over time. And, the taste just hasn't been there yet. And so I really see blended products as being able to dramatically increase the market size for meat alternatives by just tasting better.
Cool. I see that too. I concur with your assessment that, basically if it's true that 10%, like if in blind taste test focus groups, 10% animal cell inclusion to, even to an Impossible Burger, let's say as an example, back to back, if it was dramatically preferred on taste, I think that would be totally transformative.
We do blind tastes all the time internally. Obviously we can't do it with consumers. Mm-hmm. And adding the cells to our plant-based formula creates like major improvements in taste, in aroma, and overall liking.
Oh, I can't wait to do such a taste test
and try myself. Really anytime.
I will. Yeah, I just want to mention, you commented just a minute ago that a huge portion of people self-identify as flexitarians, and I too see these same polling responses. But sadly, I do think that what people tell pollsters about their behavior is more aspirational than actual.
100%. And, it has to be easy.
The facts are that meat demand on a per person basis in America has never been higher than it is today. It's literally increased virtually every year.
Every year.
There was a period between 2008 and 2014 where it actually did go down somewhat, largely, just in the aftermath of the recession for economic reasons. But people have shown like they'll eat about as much meat as they can afford. And that's true. That's true cross-culturally as countries come out of living in the undeveloped world and they start joining the developed world and start developing a middle class. Like one of the very first things they do is just start eating a lot more meat. And so I do think I have some friends who are vegan, as I am, who are, very optimistic about the world, changing and becoming vegan. But I share your point of view, Josh, that that's extremely unlikely. And I just think people want meat, so we need to find ways to produce it for them. I do want to ask you, I as you will remember, I was in your audience for a talk that you were giving at the Reducitarian Summit back in May of 2022 in San Francisco. And you were very passionately defending bioengineering as a strategy. And, there have been a lot of companies in this space that either don't want to talk about it or they don't want to use it at all because they're afraid. They're afraid that it'll turn off consumers. You've made a very different decision. Why? Why do you think that consumers either won't care or might even prefer the product because of it?
Ultimately, if a product isn't affordable and can't be produced at scale, then it doesn't matter. And, my conviction after the last 7 years being in this industry is that without the use of genetic engineering, you won't be able to produce a product that actually is at price parity with conventional meat at any kind of meaningful scale. And, that's a bit of a controversial opinion in the industry, but I really fundamentally quite strongly believe that. And so I view it as an essential, right? And so what are they going to choose versus the genetically engineered cultivated meat that's on the market and is at price parity, or the one that's not been able to scale up or just is 10x the price of conventional meat? They're going to choose the one that's affordable and available. And I think Impossible versus Beyond is a great example of this, right? Impossible are very proudly GMO, right? They use GMO soy, the genetically engineered yeast to create their heme protein. They talk about it very openly. They talk about why they're doing it and the benefits, and they sell it in Burger King and no one really cares. And most people, much prefer the Impossible Burger over a Beyond, which is proudly non-GMO, because the Impossible Burger tastes better, right? And that's ultimately what people actually care about. Like people, especially in the US, people eat huge amounts of GMO food. And again, they'll tell a poll, if you ask them, you say, do you want to eat GMO food? People say, no, I'd prefer not to. But then when they're walking down the aisle and choosing a burger to order, that's not what they actually think about or care about.
Right. Yeah. You're making a case with which I strongly identify myself. And I would go even further. Polling shows that 80% of Americans want food that contains DNA to be labeled. And so, of course, every food contains DNA, right? Like people just don't really, it's asking too much to ask consumers to be so scientifically fluent.
Yeah.
And things that sound sciencey, like DNA or bioengineering and so on, it kind of it sounds like it's something scary when, of course, to the scientifically literate, it's not. But for most people, I think it's asking too much to, for them to really comprehend, biotechnology and so on. The real question is it safe? And that'll be up to the FDA and its expertise to judge on the merits of the safety, not on public opinion, but on actual science and showing whether something is safe or not. And I think your example about Impossible is very apt, which is, to be perfectly honest, I actually like eating Beyond because it tastes less like meat to me than Impossible. Right. Obviously, my dog feels differently, but I having been vegan for the last 30 years, I don't have a strong desire to have something that tastes identical to meat. But I like the taste of meat, and if I'm traveling and there's a Burger King, I'll certainly get an Impossible Whopper for sure. But I do think like we have to go not based on what people tell pollsters, but what people actually do in 100%. The world. It actually, it kind of reminds me also of, interestingly, in California, there have been a couple votes of the populace on eggs from caged hens. And in 2018, there was a ballot measure called Prop 12. 2/3 of Californians voted to make it illegal to sell eggs that came from caged hens. 2/3 said it should be illegal to sell the eggs of caged hens. And of course, 90% of the eggs sold in California at that time were coming from caged hens. So, people were voting to ban the very thing that they were doing. Yeah. And of course, as somebody who cares deeply about animal welfare, I'm glad the vote went that way. But it's just a great example of, how we act in the voting booth or when we're telling pollsters is very different from what we do as consumers, which is basically go on taste and price. Let me ask you, Josh, you mentioned a moment ago that that you are not a vegetarian, that you do eat meat, which is somewhat different from many of the founders in the space. Many of the founders in the space are people who are vegetarians or vegans. They often came out of the animal welfare NGO world or the environmental or climate movements, but that's not you. So what's the motivating factor for you? Like you've said in interviews that, funding, is not why you're doing this, which I am sure is true. So what is like the motivating passion for you to devote your life to this?
Yeah, as I said, what initially drove the obsession was just this feeling like this was the future we had to build. And, I eat meat, but I'm very aware of the environmental devastation. And a big part of what drove me, kind of really triggered me to kind of make the switch eventually and do it myself was really just feeling such concern about how bad a direction the world was moving in from a climate change perspective. And a recognition that this is one of the most important elements for solving that problem and one that I felt needed extra help to do. And, while I eat meat, I'm, absolutely not a fan of factory farming, right? I do think that in 50 years or however long it takes, we're going to be looking back and just thinking that it was such a moral blight on humanity to be, stuffing billions of animals into these terrible conditions and slaughtering them in terrible conditions. And again, that's not the utopian future that I want the world to see. And, ultimately, I think that there is actually a lot of benefit for me as someone who eats meat to be the face of these kinds of products. I think one of the big challenges for plant-based meat has been a struggle to reach a lot of middle America, right? And it's something that's done really well among the kind of coastal elites and the food innovators and the vegans and the vegetarians and the hardcore flexitarians in LA and New York and San Francisco. But why has plant-based meat and meat become part of the culture war, right? Why when Impossible launched new products, are there people with pro-meat placards kind of protesting in front of the restaurants? Right. And I think language is a big part of that. And there has been this really kind of anti-meat rhetoric around plant-based meat. And it's understandable, right? Because there's a lot of passion and excitement around that. But if you want to switch the habits of the kind of, the normal people who like their burgers and like their beef and like their barbecue, right? It's a hard message to be getting from, no offense, but kind of from a vegan activist, right? Telling them that they should not be eating their meat. And
I can assure you, Josh, I don't take offense. In fact, I've joked for many years that I'm not the person who made up this joke, but I do repeat it, which I find funny and sadly sometimes true. Do you know what the biggest impediment to widespread veganism is?
No, but I think I can tell what you're going to say.
Yeah.
The vegans, right?
It's just it sadly is sometimes true. So, in addition to defying the odds and trying to grow cells at a density and in a manner that has not been done before, at least from what we can tell from what these companies say publicly. You also defied the odds and raised a ton of money in the middle of 2022, which is a very difficult time to be raising cash because it's a economically wintry time and VCs had their doors locked shut for the most part, but not to you. You raised a $22 million round. Congratulations. This had happened on the heels of the now famous or infamous, depending on which way you look at it, counter story about the technological lack of feasibility for cultivated meat. So with such a negative environment for fundraising, coupled with a negative environment on this lack of optimism for cultivating animal cells for commercial food purposes, what was your pitch? Like, how did you make this argument that you were the one who deserved tens of millions of dollars to actually prove the skeptics wrong and say, hey, actually, this can be done?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because this actually takes us full circle back to the beginning of the interview when I was talking about the need to listen to skeptics. And we are a little different in the cultivated meat industry because when David Humbird released his techno-economic analysis, which is the kind of basis of that counter article, we read it and we agreed with it. It largely lined up with our own techno-economic analysis. And essentially the conclusion was 100% cultivated meat, if you're not using any kind of genetic engineering and you're assuming today's supply chain and bioret technology, is not commercially viable. And we came to the exact same conclusion, right? That's why we're creating blended products. That's why we're using genetic engineering. And ultimately, we have a techno-economic analysis that shows how we can create a profitable and affordable product at scale using the same assumptions that David Humbird uses in that techno-economic analysis.
Interesting.
And,
So you're saying at scale you can make it profitable and affordable, but what about now? Like, the famous 2013 Mark Postburger, it cost $330,000. Now, of course, that was just 100% cow cells. Like, it wasn't a blended product. It didn't have even any fat in it at all. It's just pure muscle cells. But what's a SciFi burger cost to produce today? Like a 1090 hybrid product?
Yeah. So, beginning of last year, before we'd achieved this big milestone around suspension, single cell suspension, it was still $10,000 a burger. By the end of last year, we'd got it down to about $250.
$250 a burger, so basically $1,000 a pound.
Yeah, and
if it's a quarter pounder.
And this year, we were on track to get it down to about $10 a burger by the end of the year.
By the end of 2023.
Yeah, correct.
Great, exciting. Oh, that's really exciting. Well, cheaper than I thought. So
and our goal over the next few years is to get it down to $1.
Nice. Well, it already at present, if that's true, it's a lot cheaper than I thought. So I'll feel less bad feeding it to Eddie for his
we'll make him a slider
here.
That's only
That's fine. That's fine. It's just for science. That's cool. Yeah, if you're into Greek mythology, maybe this hybrid product, the first one will be called a centaur or some other hybrid animal that you could put in there. That's cool. Well, congratulations on the fundraising. It's exciting for you as a founder to be leading the company and to have that type of fundraising completed in such a difficult time to start scaling and trying to prove that this can work at greater and greater sizes. So I'm very encouraged to hear that. And of course, we'll be rooting for the success of the company. You've named some books during this interview that I will include in the show notes at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But for somebody like you who's been a serial entrepreneur with several exits, is there any resource or resources, Josh, that you think would be good to recommend? If somebody says, hey, now this guy's had two companies acquired, so he has tens of millions of dollars for a third company. This guy must know something I don't know. What resources might you recommend for them?
Yeah, there's a book which I read in my early 20s and I still reread every now and then. And, the title is not a great title in some ways, but it's purposefully kind of slightly ironic, but it's a book called How to Get Rich by Felix Dennis. And it's a kind of an anti-self-help book. Felix Dennis was a very successful entrepreneur, UK, British entrepreneur, although he did a lot of stuff in America as well, did a lot of different companies. And it's kind of a book of his personal journey and his memoir and his story and his advice to kind of young entrepreneurs. And I feel it captures the kind of heart of being a founder and the challenges of being a founder and the sacrifices that you need to make in your life in order to kind of commit yourself to this path. And I think it has a lot of true gems of wisdom that for any kind of young entrepreneur in any field at all, I think can be very impactful.
It's funny you talk about that as like, because these days, like quote unquote work-life balance is, often talked about as a very important thing. And, my own experience, both running a startup and in talking to other founders, is that if you really want a chance of success, it's very hard to say that you want work-life balance. That's something that, people talk about, but in reality is a very difficult thing to achieve. Has that been your experience?
It depends. There are times I find everything goes in cycles as a founder. And, there are times when it's just full on. Fundraising is often one of those times where it's just nonstop. It's intense. You're working late every evening, staying on top on emails and working at the weekends. And that's just how it is. And if you want to be successful, you've just got to put the grind and the hours in. There can be moments when sometimes things are a little more relaxed and you've got a great team and everyone's just executing and you're kind of heads down and, you can find some more time for other things and you can, I've learned to enjoy those moments because I know that, at some point it's going to be full on again. And you just have to find, the things that make you happy and that keep you going around the needs of the startup. And it varies. But, I also think that, startups are super hard and you have to work incredibly hard. I do think that some founders don't recognize the moments when they can step off a little bit, especially some first-time founders. There's moments of intensity where you have to be putting in the hours all the time. And then there are some times where you don't. And I know some people have kind of burnt themselves out by thinking that they need to be killing themselves every day, regardless of whether it's really essential. So you just have to get a feel for what's needed from the company.
Very good. Very good. Well, sage advice for sure. Before we let you go, Josh, one final question. Obviously, you're committed to SciFi Foods. I presume you believe you're going to be running this company for years to come. So as somebody who has founded many companies, you probably have thoughts about what companies you wish existed that don't exist. So let me ask you, are there any things that you hope maybe a listener to this show will start on their own and do something good in the world by creating that company that you're not going to do yourself?
Yeah, I think we've chatted a lot about kind of how to make the unit economics and the capex for cultivated meat work. And the reality is that this is a big challenge, not just for cultivated meat, but also for any kind of precision fermentation product. Right? There's a lot of products that just are really going to struggle because they can't quite get the economics to work. And a lot of that is from the capex and from the bioreactor technology. And there are a couple of companies, startups working on some exciting stuff around thinking about how they can create new kinds of bioreactor and biomanufacturing technology that does reduce the capex. We need them, and I think we need more. Right? I really think that's one of the biggest opportunities is if you can really invent technologies and hardware that really changes the economics of producing biomanufactured products, then that can have such a huge impact on the world for all kinds of things, from cultivated meat through to fermentation and everything else. And so that's one thing that I'd love to see more startups in.
So basically B2B players in the alternative protein space.
Correct. But, more efficient biomanufacturing technologies have all kinds of use cases. It doesn't have to be specific to cultivated meat. It can be across the entire industry.
Good point. Yeah, very good point. All right. Well, with that, Josh, congratulations again on the success that you're having. I am definitely going to take you up on this taste test opportunity. I cannot wait. So thanks in advance for offering that. And thanks for all you're doing to try to create a better meat industry.
Of course. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.